Hello and welcome to the Violin Chronicles, a show about the lives of great violin makers throughout history. My name is Linda Lespe and I am a violin maker in Sydney, Australia, with my husband Antoine. And here is the first of a three-part series on the elusive Pietro Guarneri of Mantua. I love this story about Pietro Guarneri. It has mad dukes, angry fathers, long-suffering wives, invasions, sieges, art theft, and oh so many children. A touch of court intrigue and a dash of treason. It was indeed a surprise, I can tell you, when I first started looking at this maker. Never would I have imagined such a colourful existence. So stay with me as I take a deep dive into Pietro Guarneri's Mantua. And before I start, I would like to say a very big thank you to people who have signed up to Patreon. You can do that by signing up to Patreon/The Violin Chronicles to help support the podcast. And in particular, a shout out to Iris, Hugh, Shanup, sorry if I mispronounced your name, Jacob, Stephen, Black Cats Forever, Jeff, Timothy, and Jimmy. Thank you so much. Hello and welcome back to the Violin Chronicles, and in this episode I would like to invite you to discover this wonderful maker who has for so long slipped under the radar. This guy, I would have to say, is a favourite of many experts who get a kind of look about them when they start talking about Pietro of Mantua. It reminds me of a conversation I had with a good friend who is a gemologist. She was explaining that we're often bedazzled by diamonds and almost feel like we have to have one, that they're the ultimate gemstone to aspire to. But for her and others in the industry, the stones they are drawn to would more often be rubies or sapphires. These colourful stones are far rarer in nature, harder to find, and as for sapphires, they come in endless stunning colours. They come in pinks and violets, oranges, greens and blues, and if you've ever seen a party sapphire, they're incredible. They have all these colours that move around when you move the stone. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that sometimes there are wonderful makers we can so easily pass over, and perhaps Pietro of Mantua could be one of these. Pietro Guarneri is part of the second generation of makers in this family and is often confused with his nephew, Pietro of Venice. The Pietro we are talking about today is referred to as Pietro of Mantua because he will eventually move to that city. The way I remember them is as follows. Alphabetically, M for Mantua comes before V for Venice, and if you were to travel from Cremona to Venice, you would first go through Mantua before reaching Venice. So Pietro of Mantua comes first, okay? Okay, now we can head back to Cremona, to the Guarneri household, where we find Pietro's parents, Anna Maria and Andrea, settling into their new house just around the corner from Niccolò Amati's workshop and family. The previous year, the couple's first child, Angela Teresa, had died, not even living long enough to have her first birthday. But now, on a chilly February day in 1655, they have a son they name Pietro. Pietro is the same age as Niccolò Amati's sixth child, Anna Maria, who has confusingly the same name as his mother, and he would have grown up with the Amati brothers and sisters, amongst other children in the neighbourhood. He would have also known Francesco Ruggeri's boys, who were the same generation. Antonio Stradivari was 11 years Pietro's senior. Their paths would have crossed, but for now, in the Guarneri home, Andrea is working hard to build up his business and support his young family. Here I speak to Philip Cass, violin expert and co-author of a brand new book that has just come out on the violin makers of Mantua called Luthier Mantovana. It is a 3-volume extravaganza, if I may say so, of makers from Mantua. Here we are discussing Pietro's early life in Cremona.
My name is Philip Cass. What do I do? I look at violins and ask questions about them. I'm interested in the history of the craft and what we don't understand about it and what we can do to learn about it. So I do a great deal of historical researches, And then my day job, if you can call it that, is doing appraisals and consultations for the trade and for individuals about what they have, whether they're buying or selling. The Guarneri family, starting with Andrea, had become involved in the musical instrument making trade, apprenticeship, and assistance to Niccolo Amati, who was the preeminent maker in the world at the time. Niccolo was unmarried and had no children, and I think that Andrea had every reason to expect that he might take over the business one day. And then lo and behold, Niccolo got married and had a son. And that sort of put paid to that whole concept. Anyway, it was not terribly long after that that Andrea decided to leave and start his own business, conveniently located right around the corner, and had his own son, who very early on showed great talent as a violin maker.
If you want to hear more about Andrea Guarneri and his multiple wheel making, go back and listen to the episodes on Andrea, where we look at his life and ever-changing mind. A year after Pietro is born, he has a sister, another Angela Teresa. 2 years after that, a brother, Eusebio, and then 2 more sisters, Elisabetta and Anna. And finally, when Pietro is 11, little Giuseppe Giovanni is born, the baby of the family. And doesn't he know it? He will grow up to be called Filius Andrea for several reasons that we will get into later. Now, as many an eldest child, Pietro was an overachiever. At an early age, he would have started playing an instrument. I mean, he was surrounded by the things. And not only that, but various family members were accomplished musicians who could have helped, and Pietro was someone his little brother looked up to. Idolized even. At about the age of 14, he would have started helping his father in the workshop on the ground floor of their home, and here too he excelled. His fine craftsmanship would have pulled up the standard of the workshop for the benefit of the family business. And as he grew, Pietro would help his father more and more in the construction of instruments, and perhaps now Andrea was beginning to imagine the Guarneri workshop becoming the next big thing after the Amatis. With the extra manpower of his sons and the talent of Pietro, they could really go places. From 1670 to 1675, that is when Pietro started. At the age of about 15 to his early 20s, we can see his workmanship in the instruments coming out of the Guarneri family workshop. And this is a classic case of the student surpassing the master. Pietro executed beautiful work and was a skilled craftsman. Now, the Hills, that is the London-based workshop that we spoke about in the episode on Maggini, also had a few things to say on the Guarneris, and they say at about this time.
In fact, we recognize that certain of these violins were entirely made by Pietro. But he does not, in contradiction to his brother Giuseppe, appear in a single instance to have inserted his own distinctive label.
The Hills also described Andrea, that's Pietro's father, as a good craftsman, but not equal to his teacher, Niccolo Amati. They loved Pietro's work, however, and his skill as a maker, really in essence saying that he was a more skilled craftsman than his father. Could this have been a source of conflict between the father and son? They talk of his unmistakable sound holes, accurately shaped corners, skilled purfling, full modelling, whatever that is, maybe it's the archings, and deep purfling. He had that decidedly personal touch, so distinctively his own. Philip Cass.
By the 1670s, a great deal of what was coming from Andrea Guarneri's workshop was partly or substantially the work of Pietro. And I think that his father had every reason to believe that his son would become one of the great makers and would raise the family stock up to the status of the Amatis. And indeed, that might have happened, except that Andrea Guarneri had married a woman who was from a very prominent family of musicians and with very good connections in the music world. And for better or for worse, Pietro showed great talent as a musician as well as a violin maker. And I think that at some stage, because the family finances were not ticking along quite so nicely, there were some financial issues that Andrea had that were complicated, and suggested that finances were not all that strong. Pietro decided that he would try his luck elsewhere.
In 1676, Pietro makes a viola in his father's workshop that today is called the Conte Vitali. He is about 19 years old at the time, and as he stopped and had a look around his native city, he would have remarked on the increasing number of violin makers, most of whom had learned from the same master as his father, Niccolo Amati. But how many violin makers did one average-sized city need? At this point in time, the Spanish still controlled the city. The economy was lagging, and what with all the competition, the future did not look all that bright. At the moment, there were no passing armies to stress the city's resources, but I wouldn't hold your breath. This is Cremona after all. It would only be a matter of time before something blew. Unbeknown to Pietro and his fellow citizens, this Guarneri's future employer was getting on with the job and making a series of catastrophic, brash, and really not very well thought out decisions, whilst maxing out his cards on hair products, jewels, clothes, horses, and the ladies. I give you the Duke of Mantua. But more about him later. In 1677, Pietro is 22 years old. His little bro, Eusebio, is 19 and enters the priesthood. Well, we'll see how that goes. But for now, Pietro has other things on his mind. He has just asked the lovely Caterina Sassagni to marry him. She is about the same age as his little brother, Eusebio, 19, and she has agreed. After Pietro and Caterina's wedding, the happy couple came back to live in the family home. Eusebio, Pietro's little brother, had decided he was out of there. His house was getting smaller by the day. Pietro had brought home Caterina to live with them, so presumably they get their own room, making the living space that much smaller. There is his older sister, Angela, and then the two younger girls, Elisabetta is 17 and Anna is 14, and then there's the baby, Giuseppe, who is 11, all living in the one small house. Their father, Andrea, has always refused to give up the tenants next door in the house that also belongs to them because he says they need the rent. So Eusebio is off to try out being a priest and have a bit of independence. Caterina, Pietro's wife, falls pregnant almost immediately after they are married, and Pietro and her have a little son, Andrea Francesco. Sadly, this little baby only lives 3 days. This was a trying time for Pietro, and as he headed out for another music gig, he couldn't help hearing once again about the city of Mantua with its flamboyant court full of artists and musicians who were really quite well paid. An idea started to form in his mind. If he were to be employed at the court of Mantua, he would have a house of his own. His father wouldn't dictate what he could and couldn't do. He knew he was a good violin maker. Why, just a few years ago he had made almost entirely that viola for the noble family, and they were happy with it. Only now, if he was his own man in Mantua, he would be able to put his own label in his instruments, not his father's, and what's more, there were absolutely no violin makers in Mantua to speak of. It could be just the thing to start anew with Caterina, especially after the loss of the baby. Who knew what things were like for Caterina during the day when he was in the workshop with his father and out during religious holidays and festivals playing his instrument? She, Caterina, had to live with his mother and 3 sisters. If they got along, things could be fine, but if they didn't, it would get awkward really fast, living in such close proximity. Well, 2 years after Pietro and Caterina were married, they had decided to make the move to Mantua. Eusebio, Pietro's little brother, had also decided the priesthood was definitely not for him, after trying that out for a few years, but maybe marriage was. When Pietro left the family home in Cremona, he took his wife, her dowry, and a few household items. He had some connections in Mantua, thanks to his music making, but he was confident that he would be able to find a place as a musician at the court of Mantua. If things didn't work out, they were not too far away. It was a day's journey. They could always return to Cremona, but for now Pietro was happy to leave this city that already had so many violin makers in it. It didn't know what to do with them. There was a lot of competition, and Antonio Stradivari was already taking a big chunk of the market. He wasn't leaving his father completely desperate in any case. There was always little Giuseppe, who was now starting to work in the workshop, who could help Andrea as the extra set of hands. Besides, Pietro preferred playing music, and court life in Mantua was far more interesting for a musician than Cremona. Mantua was ruled by dukes who were willing to pay handsomely for composition and the musicians who would play their music. Pietro's grandfather on his mother's side, the Orcellis, had been the organist at San Marco in Venice, and his uncle had also been a fine violinist and viol player. He too could show his skills and live as a musician. Philip Cass.
I think the first indication that something is going to happen is in August of 1679, when Pietro Guarneri's wife, Caterina Sassagni, petitioned Andrea Guarneri for the return of her dowry. Now, traditionally, the wife's dowry went to the father-in-law, who held it in trust. And
sorry, was that if they lived with him? That it would go to the father-in-law?
Yes, it was. They were living with him, and so he had it in trust. But I think that if they'd been living around the corner, it still would have been with the father-in-law. However, if they were going to move to another city, that was quite a different matter. And so in August, Pietro received the dowry from his wife, and he and his wife then moved to Mantua. There obviously was some indication that there were economic opportunities there. There was a court that was spending rather lavishly on music, so there was the opportunity to get a court appointment as a musician. There also was no violin maker there, so it was open territory. It was between August 1679 and July 1680 that Pietro Guarneri and his wife settled in Mantua, because we have the Dowry Act, the petition for the return of the dowry on the one end, we have the birth of a child in Mantua on the other end.
In August of 1679, Caterina, Pietro's wife, petitioned Andrea Guarneri, her father-in-law, for the return of her dowry. And as you could imagine, this went down like a lead balloon. They were heading into autumn, and things were not looking great on the financial front. Well, Andrea is a violin maker. Is this surprising, really? And now he is losing his best and/or only worker and Caterina's dowry and skipping off to Mantua. Well, really. Andrea was not happy. Pietro's sister Angela was about to get married, and they had to come up with her dowry. Pietro was throwing a spanner in the works by leaving and taking Caterina's dowry with him. They simply did not have the money for Angela. We can imagine Angela simmering like a pressure cooker here. Anyway, finally Andrea came to an agreement with one of the wealthier widows in the neighbourhood to lend them the money for Angela's dowry, and they would pay her back over the next 3 years with interest. Yeah, so I really do get the impression that his father was not happy about. I felt like he felt kind of abandoned because and a little bit passive aggressive. Like there's just these things saying, well, this I'm giving twice as much to Giuseppe because he's the son that stood by me.
Right. Right.
And there was another one where he was saying, I'm just basically giving the bare minimum to Pietro. Yeah. So Philip Cass.
The Hills made comments about that. I've now gone through all three of Andrea Guarneri's testamenti, and the Hills summarize it pretty well in there. It's very clear that Pietro is only going to get the bare minimum of anything, and his father begrudges him everything, but then goes out of his way, especially in the second testamento, to cite how Giuseppe has been his supporter and his assistant, and has put in all his time and effort in the making of violins, the implication being not like that ne'er-do-well brother of his who went to Mantua and made a big career as a musician. But I think that Andrea really probably thought, Pietro, this is one of the most talented violin makers in our history, as talented as Niccolo Amati. Potentially, we could become the Amatis of the next generation. And then he turns around and says, oh, I'm going to go and take this job in Mantua. I think it's much better opportunity for me. And I think it floored his father's plans. Now, Giuseppe is a terrific maker in his own right. And, it's very clear to me from his early work that he just idolized his brother. He goes out of his way to try to imitate everything his brother did in his work, with slight differences. But that's essentially what the future of the Guarneri shop was going to be. It's just that Pietro was not going to be a part of it.
Today, the distance between Cremona and Mantua is about 70 kilometres or 45 miles, and you can do that trip in an hour in your speedy little Italian car. But in Pietro's day, it was like moving to another country. Remember that Cremona was under Spanish rule. Mantua was technically an independent dukedom at the moment, in cahoots with France. And so to understand what kind of court Pietro was going to work at, we have to understand what was going on with the dukes of Mantua at the time. Now brace yourselves, this story is full of complicated alliances and unstable relationships. A bit like Days of Our Lives meets Star Wars, but here we go. Zoom in to the Mantuan court. Anna Isabella Gonzaga sat tapping her fingers rhythmically on the dresser, inwardly seething. Years of being taught to control her emotions and to comport herself like a lady were the only things holding her temper back. How dare he? Guastalla was hers and everyone knew it. In 1679, a year before Pietro moves to Mantua, Anna Isabella Gonzaga was the Duchess of Mantua and had been since she was 16 years old. She's 24 now. And in the tradition of the great dukes and duchesses of this city, her court was full of talented artists, musicians, composers, even craftsmen. She was even thinking of employing a luthier to make instruments for the court from Cremona. The city renowned for producing the greatest instrument makers, no less. She was an intelligent and powerful woman, some might say controlling and strategic, but that's the job description in Renaissance Mantua, isn't it? So no, she was not going to let her cousin swan in and take Guastalla, her hometown, from her. Anna Isabella Gonzaga was the heir to her father's dukedom, the small yet prosperous city of Guastalla, 30 kilometres or 19 miles south of Mantua. Her husband was actually the Duke of Mantua, and she had married him. And like Mantua, Guastalla boasted a court brimming with artists, musicians, poets, composers, architects, and fine craftsmen. A court to rival any in the Renaissance era. But when her father died, when Anna Isabella was just 18 and having no sons, his title was left to his eldest daughter, the current Duchess of Mantua, her. When Anna had married the 19-year-old Duke of Mantua, Ferdinando Carlo, she herself was only 16. Their aunt, none other than the Empress Dowager Eleonora Gonzaga, had arranged the marriage to bring together the two branches of the Gonzaga family in the hope that they would stop fighting and get on with things. Anna Isabella came from the Guastalla Gonzagas, and Ferdinand came from the French branch, and yes, they were cousins, let's keep it in the family, and no, they would never have children. I wonder why. A problem for another day, because right now, the Mantuan Duke and Duchess were in the process of losing the tidy little dukedom of Guastalla to Anna Isabella's cousin, Vincenzo, the closest male heir. He probably thought they were pushovers being such a young power couple, and now, a year after her father's death, he had made his move, marrying her younger sister, and also his cousin, Anna Maria. How dare he? And now he has proclaimed himself the Duke of Guastalla. Mantua would not take this sitting down, even now. Ferdinand's advisors were with him. He would contest Don Vincenzo and take back Guastalla. Now, all this is happening at the same time that Pietro and Caterina are moving to Mantua. The year is 1679, and as Anna Isabella is brooding on the loss of her hometown, Pietro Guarneri has packed up his belongings in Cremona and moved to Mantua to make a life for himself. The first thing Pietro would have done once he arrived in Mantua was to present himself at the Gonzaga court, and although the young Duke Ferdinand was a great lover of the arts and surrounded himself with the finest of everything, reliability was not his middle name, and as time went on the court realized that it was his young wife, Anna Isabella, his duchess, who you needed to address to find a place, for example, as a court musician. A bit of a case of, do you want to talk to the man in charge or the woman who knows what's going on? In any case, Ferdinand was busy. He had parties to attend, women to woo, and lots of hair to curl. He was throwing money he didn't have at the arts and charitable associations. It wasn't easy running a dukedom, and well, he had to wear fabulous clothes and look good, or no one would take him seriously. With his advisors, Ferdinand ran the dukedom quite well, actually, to the extent that they were becoming more and more independent of the ruling Spanish. And don't you worry, the Spanish had noticed this too. Was Mantua thinking of breaking away and becoming its own independent principality? They really were a little bit too cozy with the French for their liking, and so they were keeping a very close eye on Mantua. Philip Cass describes the city of Mantua at the time of Pietro Guarneri.
It had started as a Roman settlement at sort of the oxbow of the river. And when the Gonzagas took it over, they built a palace. They actually took somebody else's palace when they took over the town. And they turned that into a fortified bastion with a fortified embankments all the way around. And in particular, this big fortress with a moat around it that was fed from the rivers. And then the palace just grew out from that. They just kept expanding the walls and building new buildings. It's this massively elaborate complex, and it occupies a significant part of the northern part of the city. When you look at the map, you'll see the Piazza Sordello, where there's the cathedral, and most of the area to the east and north of that was all the ducal palace. Pietro is just south of that, next to the church of San Andrea.
Oh, wow. So I'm imagining like a lot of palace, and then they have to squish all the other people in somewhere.
Right.
Okay.
And most of the residencies then were between the palace and the little river that ran through the middle of it. And then gradually it just grew on the other side.
Yeah, okay.
Expanded all the way down to the Palazzo Te. There were special rooms that were built for music by the earlier dukes, and one of them was the room in which Monteverdi led the court ensemble for a period. The most famous room there, though, where they spent a lot of money on music, and it was clearly very important too, but they spent a lot of money on art and architecture. They had, Giulio Romano was, who's Venetian, was one of the great artists there, but probably the single greatest artist they had in their employ was Andrea Mantegna. And Mantegna then frescoed one of the bedrooms of the early members of the Gonzaga family. This is the room called the Camera degli Sposi. And in fact, if you want to go and visit the palace, it's a separate ticket to go to see the Camera degli Sposi. Yeah, because they've got lines waiting to get into it. It's just incredible.
Now, the reality was that this seemingly wealthy court with its fine artists and trend-setting nobles was, in fact, a sinking ship. There were cracks in the hull that no one could see just yet, but things were definitely on a slippery slope. And the only thing to say in Ferdinand's defence would be that he had inherited this vessel at the already sinking stage. If Mantua was the Titanic, the lifeboats would have been deployed by now. In short, the Duke Ferdinand had no money, but what he did have was a plan. Okay, things were not looking good with Guastalla, the town his wife came from, and just between you and me, this was probably his fault, but we can get into that later. He had sent his minister, Ercole Mattioli, to France for advice, and a solution was found. In a secret treaty, Mantua granted Louis XIV the right to station men in the fortress of Casale, known as the Key to Italy. And for this tidy manoeuvre, he would be given 100,000 scudi for services never performed as head of the French armies in Italy. At the same time, this Mantuan minister, Ercole Mattioli was persuaded for an interesting amount of money to kiss and tell about his deal to the Savoyards. This created no end of problems for the French, who then arrested the Mantuan minister and locked him up. Many believe this double agent was, in fact, the famous Man in the Iron Mask. But hey, it's 1680, and Pietro and his young wife Caterina arrive in Mantua, fresh-faced and bushy-tailed, ready for a bright new future. Let's see how things go. Philip Cass.
He did not initially or immediately get an appointment. That took a while. However, in 1682, he approached the family that owned the monopoly rights for the manufacture of strings. And it was one of the quirks of Mantua that this had been set aside as a monopoly. And initially it had been sold to one of the dancers within the court. It passed on to his daughter, who in turn leased it out to another man. Pietro came to town, and he then said, "I'll buy it from you." And so they sold it to him in 2 monthly installments under 2 very unusual conditions. Number one, he would not receive the actual monopoly right until the man who had the lease for the monopoly right either died or retired. And number two, if he left town, it was forfeit. So that automatically indicated there was no way he was going back to Cremona. He was putting down his roots in Mantua and was going to stay there.
Now we return to our young couple, Pietro and his wife, who have just moved to Mantua. Caterina has just had their second child, a little girl, Anna Maria. There are a lot of Anna Marias in this story. Named after Pietro's mother, they have found a place to stay thanks to some contacts of Pietro's from the music world, and now he is concentrating on setting up a small workshop where he can service instruments of the many musicians residing at the court of Mantua. There are no luthiers or violin makers in the city, so this shouldn't be too hard to spread the word that he's now in town. And secondly, he is going to look for work as a musician, because this is where things were getting interesting for violin and viol players such as himself. The Gonzaga court had composers, artists, artisans and musicians under their patronage, and if Pietro could only get himself appointed as a court musician, he and his family would be guaranteed an income, a little bit like a civil servant. Philip Cass talks about the lengths the Gonzagas went to keep their artists in-house.
The Gonzagas had great difficulty keeping employees. They'd come to Mantua, and they'd discover it was cold and wet all winter long, and that then it was blazing hot and full of malaria in the summer, and they'd want to find some much nicer and more temperate environment to be in. And there's cases of several of the people who were in their employ, artists, and sculptors who would simply go on a holiday somewhere else and then just send back notes, "Oh, I'm not returning." So what happened after a while was that the Gonzagas, if you got their employment, you had to turn in your passport and you could not leave the city. And when they really decided they trusted you, they would grant you a passport. And what's interesting with Pietro is that the 1685 agreement gives him the appointment and states a salary. No mention is made about passports at all. When he gets it's restated and he receives a promotion, more money, they still don't mention anything. The third agreement in 1693 says, and he also is given a passport. And that's the first opportunity that he could use. And the first thing he did with that passport was go to Guastalla and see his future mother-in-law, actually, by that time, his mother-in-law, and get the money that he needed to buy the house. But up until that date, he could not leave town.
Oh, or he'd lose his job.
He'd lose his job and probably lose his property too.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was so constraining, because I was thinking, it's not that far from Cremona. He could go back and visit, but you can't.
It's very close, but there's a very definite border between the two.
Yeah.
And especially getting out of Mantua, because in those days, the swampland was uncrossable. And the area, the Palazzo Te, this beautiful palace with gardens, was originally on an island, and the waters around it were really just kept everything in. So you needed to go through a border crossing just to get out of town.
Yeah, so they could control things quite thoroughly.
Right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so they've trapped you in the swamp, in this island in a swamp, basically.
I mean,
But that was very musical.
Yeah. They had this system rigged up whereby, in the event of a major invasion, if they needed to, they could break some dikes upriver that would flood the Mincio River and flood the swampland to the depth of about 10 feet. So it was, and they were wide, so it's like a half a mile to a mile of swampland that would then be 10 feet deep. It would be a lake.
Oh, wow.
And you could not get an army across that. So they were protected. The only thing they had to worry about was getting in food and not getting sick from cholera, which they managed to do often enough as well.
Yeah, and I suppose they had like bacterial warfare as well. Like they were like, you can't get in, we'll kill you with malaria before you do.
Yeah.
In 1682, after 2 years of working in this new city, Pietro was doing quite well for himself. He and Caterina were living comfortably in their new home with the baby. Caterina was pregnant once again, and Pietro had made good contacts with the Gonzaga court. He had a knack at managing his money. Goodness knows where this instinct came from. He seems to be the only one in the family to do so. News from home was that his father was having to borrow money to pay for one of his sister's dowries, Elisabetta. She was marrying Giuseppe Sai. Sai was in fact living not far away here in Mantua, and he had told Pietro that soon they would be neighbours with his sister. It would be nice to have some family close by. Unfortunately, he couldn't help his father with the dowry payments just yet, as he was only himself just setting things in place with his business. And so far, even though he was generating a good income, he still was not an official employee of the Gonzaga court, but he was working on that. At the moment, he couldn't even return to Cremona, even if he wanted to. It was important to be present at court for employment opportunities, and this is how he got wind of a venture that looked like a good business opportunity. Through his court contacts, he heard that the monopoly on the sale of strings was up for grabs. Pietro had the cash, but there were some conditions attached. But right now, he felt like a betting man. He would only receive the income from the strings when the present holder of the patent died. But life was utterly unassured in 17th century Lombardy, and if Pietro was a betting man, he would not have to wait long for the present holder of the string monopoly to move along. Mantua was kind of on a swamp. Although the Guarneris were settling in nicely in Mantua, sadly their second daughter, the little Anna Maria, died just before her second birthday. It was always heartbreaking to lose a child, and hopefully it wouldn't affect Caterina too greatly, as she was already 5 months pregnant with another baby. Shortly after Anna Maria died, she gave birth to their third daughter, whom they also named Anna Maria. But this little girl had a third name, Anna Maria Caterina, after both her grandmother and her mother. In 1685, 3 years on, and Pietro is finally appointed court musician under the Gonzaga patronage. Officially, it was the Duke Ferdinando Carlo who had appointed him, but it was common knowledge that his real boss was the Duchess, Anna Isabella. Not only was he recognized as a musician at court, but also as an instrument maker. And now, with his official position cemented into place as a first job, he also was commissioned to make a set of instruments for the Duchess Anna Isabella. For the Duke of Mantua. I spoke to Philip Cass about a set of instruments Pietro made for the Gonzaga court, decorated with the fleur-de-lis motif.
One of the little quirks about Mantua was that in the early 1600s, 1628, the last of the Italian Gonzagas died with no heir. And that last Gonzaga set up as his heir a child from the French branch of the Gonzaga family. So automatically then Mantua became a territory of the Gonzagas, but ultimately answerable to the French court, because everything ended up being answerable to the French court, which didn't please anybody else around them either. So this became a very unstable situation and ultimately led to a war. The war in which all of the great violin makers contracted the plague and died was actually caused by determining who was going to be in control of Mantua. Would it be the Emperor of Austria? Would it be the King of France? Would it be the new Duke of Mantua? Anyway, there were warring armies through that region, and the warring armies who came down from the Tyrol brought with them the plague, and it spread everywhere. In the end, actually...
Wait a second. Sorry. What year are you in? You're at 1620s?
It started 1628, it began, and 1631-32 it ended. But when the armies came in, they brought the plague with them, and it very quickly spread, so that there was massive devastation. The economic and population devastation of Mantua was horrific. It was this town that was essentially an island, which had cold, humid weather all winter for pneumonia, and hot, humid weather all summer for malaria, because it was also very swampy. Amazingly, the French Duke of Mantua got to keep his title, but it was a very unstable situation from there. Now, the last of the French Gonzagas was the one who was ruling at the time that Pietro went there. And because the French Gonzagas were part of France, they incorporated the fleur-de-lis into their own crest, and that's why the fleur-de-lis are on the corners of those instruments.
So how many of those instruments did he make? Is it the Shapiro?
I think there's about 4 or 5 of them that I know of. The gamba type instruments, the treble, viol, and yale, and the other ones that have been altered substantially to try to make them into violas or whatnot, also probably date from that period. From 84 until probably around 88 or 89, that he appears to have made an ensemble for the court. Now, this is off books. This is not carried in the account books of orders for the Gonzaga court, but it's a commonality between all those instruments that suggests that it was deliberate for their purposes. Meanwhile, in 1685, he did receive a court appointment as a musician, but which also acknowledged that he was a violin maker.
Right. And would he have been allowed to use the fleur-de-lis if on an instrument that wasn't for the court, or was that a symbol that was reserved for the nobility?
Well, the fleur-de-lis was a symbol for the court, and therefore the instruments he made for them would have had the fleur-de-lis. But he didn't use that on any of his other instruments.
Okay. And here we come to the end of this first episode of Pietro of Mantua. We leave him with his ever-expanding family, setting their roots down in their new home under the patronage of the Gonzaga family. He and his wife have left their hometown of Cremona and appear to be making a success of their new situation. If only they can survive the waves of malaria and stave off the pneumonia, perhaps things will turn out not so bad for them after all. But to find out, do join me for the next episode of the Violin Chronicles, where we will see the Duke of Mantua's behaviour go from bad to worse, quite frankly, and how the Guarneris will continue to thrive. I would like to say a big thank you to Philip Cass for talking to me, and to you, dear listeners, for supporting this podcast, whether it be by giving me some stars on your streaming platform, writing a review, telling your friends, well, those who are interested in this kind of thing, or by signing up to Patreon for more episodes. Go to Patreon/The Violin Chronicles for that. It is also very helpful, and I hope to catch you next time on The Violin Chronicles.